A German fighter pilot flew up behind a crippled American bomber, put his guns on it, and then escorted it home. December the 20th, 1943, somewhere over northern Germany. Franz Stigler was on the ground refueling and rearming when he heard an aircraft engine that was wrong, too low, too slow, and coming from the wrong direction. He looked up and saw a four-engine bomber crossing the field at a few hundred feet, and he could not understand what he was looking at. He climbed into his Messerschmitt and went after it, because it was the easiest kill of his career. He came up behind it and stopped firing before he ever started. There was no tail gun answering him, because there was no tail gunner left. Through the holes in the fuselage he could see the ribs of the airframe, and inside it, men kneeling over other men on the floor, working on them. One engine was dead. Another was failing. The nose section was open to the sky. And the aeroplane was still flying west, in a straight line, at 200 miles an hour, as if nobody aboard had noticed it should have fallen out of the air already. What Franz Stigler did in the next 20 minutes was, under German military law, treason, punishable by execution. He knew that when he did it. He never reported it, and neither did the Americans, and for 46 years each of them believed the other had gone to his grave without knowing. This is what happened in the air that day, and what happened when they finally found each other. Start with the American, because he should not have been flying that day at all. Second Lieutenant Charles Brown, Charlie, was 21 years old, a farm boy from Weston, West Virginia, and the 20th of December was his first mission as a pilot in command. His aircraft was a B-17F named Ye Old Pub. His crew, in the photograph you are looking at, were 9 other young men, most of them younger than him. The target was the Focke-Wulf aircraft factory at Bremen. In the briefing that morning they were told two things, that Bremen was ringed by more than 250 anti-aircraft guns, and that they could expect hundreds of German fighters. Brown's position in the formation was the worst one available, the outside of the low squadron, the spot the crews called Purple Heart Corner, because it was the corner the fighters came for first. Understand what a bombing mission over Germany in late 1943 actually was, because it explains everything that follows. The bombers flew in tight formation at 25,000 feet, in unpressurized aluminium, breathing through oxygen masks, at temperatures around 60 degrees below zero. The guns froze. The men froze. There were no long-range escort fighters yet, the Mustangs that would change the air war were still weeks away. For most of the flight, the crews were on their own. Statistically, the crews knew what their odds were, and they talked about it the way men talk about weather. A tour was 25 missions. Loss rates in that period ran high enough that finishing 25 was, for long stretches of 1943, closer to a coin flip than a plan. Charlie Brown was on number 1. They were hit before they reached the target. Flak knocked out the number 2 engine and damaged number 4, which meant that going in over Bremen, Ye Old Pub was already slower than the formation around it, and a bomber that cannot keep up with the formation is a bomber flying alone. They dropped their bombs. Then the fighters found them. What followed was somewhere between 8 and 15 separate attacks by Bf-109s and Fw-190s, over roughly 10 minutes. This is what a Messerschmitt 109 looked like from the outside. From inside a bomber, they arrived as a shape in the sun and a line of tracer, and then the next one. The pub's remaining guns froze, one after another, until only 2 were still firing. A bomber under fighter attack was not a duel, it was arithmetic. A Bf-109 closed from behind at a combined speed of several hundred miles an hour, fired for perhaps 2 seconds, and broke away, and the aluminium skin of a B-17 was about as thick as a coin. 20mm cannon shells went through it and detonated inside. 10 minutes of that is not a fight anyone wins. It is a question of how much aeroplane is left when the fighters run out of ammunition. Read the damage list, because it is the reason the German pilot could not believe his eyes. 2 engines out. The third losing power. No oxygen system, no hydraulics, no working electrics. The nose glass shot away. The internal oxygen and radio equipment destroyed. Half the rudder and most of the left horizontal stabilizer simply gone. The photograph you are looking at is a different B-17 that came home in that condition, because photographs of an aeroplane like this usually do not exist, for the obvious reason. And the men. The tail gunner, Sergeant Hugh Eckenrode, was dead at his position. One waist gunner had a leg torn open, another was hit in the shoulder. The engineer was wounded, the radio operator was wounded. Brown himself was hit in the shoulder and had blacked out from lack of oxygen. The aircraft had gone into a spiral and he came to at a few thousand feet with the ground filling the windscreen, and pulled out of it without ever knowing how. That spiral is why Franz Stigler saw the bomber at all. It had fallen out of the formation, out of the fight, and out of the sky, down to a few hundred feet, alone, wandering west across the airfields of northern Germany. And it flew directly over the one where Stigler was standing beside his aircraft, waiting for the fuel truck. So meet the German. Franz Stigler was 26, from Bavaria, and he had been flying since he was 12 years old. His father taught him in a glider. Before the war he flew for Deutsche Lufthansa, the airline. He was, by any technical measure, one of the most experienced fighter pilots alive. 487 combat missions, 22 victories at that point, shot down 17 times himself. And he had a reason to want that bomber, which is the part of this story people tend to skip. Stigler needed one more confirmed kill for the Knight's Cross, Germany's highest award for valor, the thing every fighter pilot in the Luftwaffe measured his life against. A crippled 4-engine bomber, alone, at low altitude, with no escort and no working guns, is not a fight. It is a formality. He needed one. This was one. He also had a reason to hate the men inside it. His older brother August, a bomber pilot, had been killed in 1940. And by December 1943, the cities that Franz Stigler defended were being flattened from the air, week after week, with tens of thousands of German civilians dead in the firestorms. Nothing about his situation suggested mercy. Everything about it suggested he should pull the trigger, get the cross, and go home. What stopped him was a sentence he had heard in North Africa 2 years earlier, from his first squadron commander, Gustav Rodel. Rodel had told his young pilots that they were fighting according to rules, and then he had made it personal. If I ever hear of one of you shooting at a man in a parachute, I will shoot you myself. Stigler said later that when he came up behind ye old pub and looked into the fuselage, he did not see an enemy aircraft. He saw men in a parachute, men who could not fight back, being kept alive by their friends on the floor of a wrecked aeroplane. So he flew up alongside them instead. He came in off Brown's left wing, close enough that the two pilots could see each other's faces, and tried for several minutes to communicate. He pointed at the ground, land. He pointed towards Sweden, which was 20 minutes away and neutral, and where the crew would have been interned and would have survived the war. Brown, in the cockpit, understood none of it. Put yourself in that cockpit for a moment. You are 21 years old, on your first mission as a pilot, shot in the shoulder, most of your crew wounded and one man dead, flying an aeroplane that should not be in the air, and a German fighter is sitting on your wing, gesturing at you. Brown told his top turret gunner to train his guns on it. He said afterwards that he assumed the German was toying with them, or lining up other fighters, and that the thought of a Messerschmitt trying to help him never entered his mind. What Stigler was actually doing was more deliberate than kindness. He tucked himself in on the bomber's wing and stayed there, because German anti-aircraft batteries would not fire on a formation containing one of their own fighters. He flew them across the German coastal flak belt as a shield. And when they reached the open water of the North Sea, he pulled ahead where Brown could see him clearly, saluted, and turned back toward Germany. He landed, said nothing about it in his debrief, and never mentioned it to anyone in the Luftwaffe for the rest of the war. If it had been reported, by a ground observer, by another pilot, by a flak crew that had seen a Messerschmitt escorting an enemy bomber out to sea, the charge would have been treason, and the sentence would have been death. He carried it as a private secret for nearly 50 years. Charlie Brown flew ye old pub 250 miles across the North Sea on 1.5 engines and landed her at the first airfield he found in England. This is what a B-17 looked like at the end of a landing like that. Of 10 men aboard, 1 was dead and 6 were wounded. Every one of the others walked away. At the debriefing, Brown told the truth: a German fighter had escorted them out and then saluted. His superiors told him to stop talking about it. The story was, in the language of the time, bad for morale. The last thing the 8th Air Force wanted in the winter of 1943 was crews wondering whether the men shooting at them were decent. The incident was classified, and Brown was ordered to keep it to himself. So he did. He flew his remaining missions, survived the war, stayed in the Air Force, later worked for the State Department, and raised a family. He did not talk about the German for decades. But by his own account he never got through a December without thinking about him, and in retirement the thing that bothered him was very specific: he had never been able to say thank you, and he did not know if the man was alive, or what he had risked, or why he had done it. In 1986, at a reunion, someone asked Brown whether anything unusual had ever happened to him in combat, and 43 years of silence came out. Then he started looking. He wrote to the Air Force. He wrote to German veterans associations. He put a letter in a newsletter for former Luftwaffe fighter pilots, describing a date, a place, a crippled bomber and a Messerschmitt that did not fire, and asked whether anyone knew who the pilot had been. In January 1990, he got a letter back. It came from Vancouver, in Canada, where a retired businessman had been living since 1953. It said, in effect, "I was the one." And then it described the encounter from the other side, the holes in the fuselage, the men working on the floor, the attempt to point towards Sweden, the salute over the water, including details that had never been published anywhere, because only 2 people in the world had seen them. They met a few months later in a hotel lobby in Florida. Brown said he recognized him instantly. Stigler, who spoke English with an accent he never lost, said the first thing that came into his head, which was, "I love you, Charlie." Both men were in their 60s and neither of them managed to say much else for a while. What followed was 18 years of friendship. They went to reunions together, gave talks together, went fishing together, and traveled to meet each other's families. Stigler came to a gathering of Brown's surviving crew members, men who were alive, and had children and grandchildren alive, specifically because of a decision he had made in 20 minutes in 1943 and told nobody about. He said that meeting them was the best day of his life. Stigler said something else, repeatedly, that is worth quoting because it explains the whole story better than any analysis of it. He said that the bomber's crew were the ones who were in trouble, and that he could not shoot at men who could not shoot back, and then he said, "I could not have done it. I would have had to live with it." Franz Stigler died in March 2008. Charlie Brown died that November, 8 months later. They were 87 and 86. In the years since, the story has been told in a best-selling book, in songs, in 100 documentaries, and the reason it keeps being told is not that it is unusual for a soldier to be decent. It is that on the 20th of December 1943, being decent required Franz Stigler to knowingly commit a capital offense against his own country, on behalf of 10 men he had been sent to kill, whose names he did not know, and who would never be able to thank him. There is a detail from the very end that I keep coming back to. When Franz Stigler was asked, late in life, what he had thought about during those 20 minutes on the bomber's wing. He did not talk about honor or about the Knight's Cross he never received. He said he kept thinking about his brother August, the bomber pilot who had been killed in 1940, and that somewhere over the North Sea it occurred to him that a family in America was about to get the same telegram his mother had, unless he did something about it. So here is the question this one leaves. Every incentive Franz Stigler had that morning pointed one way: the medal he needed, the brother he had lost, the cities burning behind him, the law that would kill him if he did anything else. And the men in that bomber could not have stopped him. He chose the one course of action that gained him nothing and risked everything, and then kept it secret for 46 years, which means he did not even do it for the story. Would you have fired? Tell me in the comments, and subscribe. Every battle comes down to one moment. The last salvo.